The year was 1775, and the colonies of British America were trembling with rebellion. In the small tidewater county of Westmoreland, Virginia, a 17-year-old boy named James Monroe watched as his world began to shift. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with steady eyes and a sense of gravity beyond his years, the son of a modest planter who believed that freedom, once kindled, could never be extinguished. When the first shots of the Revolution rang out at Lexington and Concord, Monroe left his studies at the College of William and Mary to take up arms. Like so many young men of his generation, he was carried forward by conviction more than experience. He joined the Continental Army, shouldering a musket in the 3rd Virginia Regiment, not knowing that the path ahead would lead him through blood, frost, and the very heart of history. His first test came at the Battle of Trenton. On that icy Christmas night in 1776, as Washington's ragged army crossed the Delaware River under sleet and darkness, Monroe stood among them, a young lieutenant, frozen to the bone but fierce in purpose. When dawn broke and the Hessian garrison awoke to thunder and musket fire, Monroe charged into the fray. A musket ball tore through his shoulder, nearly killing him. He was only 18. Washington himself praised Monroe's bravery. The wound would mark him for life, a scar that ached whenever the cold came, a reminder that liberty demanded more than words. It demanded blood. After months of recovery, Monroe continued to serve, now as an officer under General Charles Lee and later General Sterling. He endured the bitter winter at Valley Forge, where the Revolution's faith was tested not by battle, but by hunger and despair. There, amid the snow and sickness, Monroe witnessed the price of independence not as an idea, but as endurance, the ability to suffer and still believe. During those bleak days, Monroe met men who would shape the next half-century. Alexander Hamilton, whose brilliance matched his arrogance. James Madison, a quiet, watchful thinker from his own state. And Thomas Jefferson, whose words had already lit the world aflame. Monroe admired Jefferson deeply. Jefferson saw in Monroe a soldier of sincerity, a man of fewer words but steadier heart. Their friendship would become one of the most influential bonds in early American politics, bridging idealism and action. As the war dragged on, Monroe found himself not merely a soldier, but a student of revolution. Between battles, he devoured books on law and philosophy. He wrote letters filled with reflections on government and human rights. A people must govern themselves, for no power born of kings can hold dominion over reason. Those words, written in a soldier's tent, foreshadowed the doctrine that would one day bear his name. When peace finally came in 1883, the young veteran returned home changed, his left arm stiff from the musket wound, his face weathered by war, his ideals tempered by experience. He had seen tyranny, chaos, and courage, and he understood that the true test of freedom would not be defeating Britain, but learning how to govern the peace. The new nation was fragile. The Articles of Confederation were crumbling. States bickered like jealous siblings. The treasury was empty. Yet in the air there was a sense of dawning, the first breath of a republic struggling to find its voice. Monroe, like many veterans, felt called to serve again, this time with pen and reason instead of sword and musket. He resumed his studies in law under Jefferson's guidance at Monticello, walking the fields of Virginia while discussing the nature of government, liberty, and duty. Jefferson often told him, "Revolution is not an end, but a beginning." Monroe listened, absorbing every word. In 1866, as he rode through the quiet fields of his own state, Monroe felt the stirring of a new purpose. He had fought for liberty. Now he would help define it. The boy soldier of Trenton was becoming something rarer, a statesman forged from both battle and thought. America was still a dream, uncertain, young, and wild. But for James Monroe, the dream was worth every scar. After the guns of the Revolution fell silent, James Monroe returned to Virginia with a soldier's scars and a thinker's curiosity. The young republic was raw and uncertain, a patchwork of states tied together by little more than hope. The Articles of Confederation had proven weak. The nation teetered between unity and disintegration. It was in this turbulent moment that Monroe found his mentor, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, then governor of Virginia, welcomed Monroe not as a mere protege, but as a fellow traveler in the long experiment of liberty. He recognized in the young veteran a rare balance of humility and resolve, a man who could listen as intently as he could lead. Under Jefferson's guidance, Monroe began studying law, but their lessons often wandered beyond statutes. They discussed the nature of freedom, the architecture of power, and the eternal tug-of-war between government and the governed. Their conversations, held under the shade of Monticello's oaks, were half philosophy, half prophecy. Jefferson would say, "Government must be the servant of man, not his master." Monroe, thoughtful and deliberate, would reply, "And yet, without strength, it cannot serve at all." That tension between liberty and order would haunt Monroe's political life. Where Jefferson soared in ideals, Monroe stayed grounded in practicality. He admired his mentor's brilliance, but he had seen too much chaos in war to believe that freedom could survive without discipline. By 1786, Jefferson's influence had shaped Monroe into something new, not merely a patriot, but a Republican in the truest sense. When the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia the following year, Monroe watched with cautious optimism. He feared that a strong central government might smother the states, but he also saw the need for unity. He corresponded frequently with Madison, whose quiet intellect and methodical reasoning fascinated him. Madison, too, had been Jefferson's pupil, and the three Virginians would soon form a political triad that defined the coming era. Monroe entered public life with a modest demeanor but unshakable purpose. He was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates, where he quickly gained a reputation for fairness and independence. He opposed privilege and aristocracy, believing that government must spring from the common soil of its people. When he later joined the Confederation Congress, he worked tirelessly for Western expansion, envisioning a nation that stretched beyond the Appalachian Mountains, a continental republic bound not by kings, but by shared destiny. In New York, where Congress then met, Monroe witnessed firsthand the fragility of the new Union. States quarreled over trade, soldiers went unpaid, European powers circled like vultures. The Revolution had freed America, but the peace might yet destroy her. Monroe's letters from this period reveal both frustration and faith. "We are free," he wrote, "yet freedom without structure is a storm unmoored. The spirit that won us liberty must now learn the art of preservation." Jefferson's mentorship continued even across the Atlantic as Jefferson departed for France in 1784 to serve as minister to Paris. Their correspondence deepened Monroe's understanding of the world. Through Jefferson's eyes, he glimpsed Europe's old systems, monarchies bloated with pride, nations trembling under hereditary rule, and he became convinced that America's experiment must stand apart from such decay. In 1789, Monroe married Elizabeth Court Wright, the spirited daughter of a New York merchant. She was refined, intelligent, and possessed a quiet grace that steadied his serious temperament. Their partnership would endure through decades of upheaval, from embassies in foreign courts to the storms of politics at home. Where Monroe's public life demanded resilience, Elizabeth provided warmth and grounding. They were, as one friend described, a union of reason and affection. By the dawn of the 1790s, Monroe had emerged as a rising star among the Jeffersonian Republicans, opposing the growing centralization favored by Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists. He believed in the sovereignty of the people, in limited government, and in foreign neutrality, principles that would guide him through every crisis ahead. Yet beneath his calm demeanor, Monroe carried the weight of doubt. The Revolution had ended, but the struggle for America's soul was only beginning. He often recalled something Jefferson once told him during a walk through Monticello's gardens. "The great battle is not against kings, James. It is against the habits that make men seek them." Those words became a quiet compass. They reminded Monroe that liberty was not a fixed state, but a practice, one that required constant vigilance and humility. As he prepared to enter the Senate, he knew that politics, like war, would test his endurance, his convictions, and his loyalty to both friend and country. The soldier had become a student. The student was becoming a statesman. And in the calm before the storm, Monroe began to see the contours of the destiny that awaited him, one that would carry his name far beyond Virginia's hills and into the annals of the world. When James Monroe arrived in Paris in 1794, the city was in chaos. The air itself seemed charged with fever and fear, a mixture of liberty and blood. The French Revolution, once a beacon of human hope, had turned on itself. The guillotine cast its long shadow over every public square, and the word citizen had become both a greeting and a warning. Monroe had been sent by President Washington to replace Gouverneur Morris, whose sympathies for the aristocracy had angered the new French government. Monroe's task was to repair relations with France, which had grown cold as America drifted closer to Britain under Hamilton's trade policies. The mission was delicate, like walking on a tightrope over a pit of ideology and suspicion. As his carriage rattled through the crowded streets of Paris, Monroe saw the tricolor flags fluttering from every window, the faces of ordinary people lit by both desperation and conviction. He had fought for freedom himself, but this was revolution stripped bare. The French did not just challenge their rulers, they had abolished them. When Monroe presented his credentials to the National Convention, his speech, simple, sincere, and full of warmth, drew rare applause. He spoke as one revolutionary to another. The cause of liberty is the cause of all mankind. It is the thread that binds our nations, and we must guard it against tyranny in every form. In that moment, Monroe became a hero in Paris. The newspapers praised him as the American friend of liberty. Crowds cheered him in the streets. His presence reminded them that the dream of freedom still had an ally across the ocean. But diplomacy, Monroe soon learned, was not poetry. The United States government had quietly signed Jay's Treaty with Britain, a move that enraged France. The treaty, meant to avoid another war, granted Britain favorable trading terms. To the French, it looked like betrayal. To Monroe, it felt like humiliation. He had spoken to the French of friendship. Meanwhile, Washington's cabinet had whispered with Britain behind closed doors. Monroe was caught between his loyalty to the administration and his own belief that America owed France at least gratitude, if not alliance. His letters home grew increasingly frustrated. We must remember who stood with us when we were but rebels and dreamers. It was not Britain who recognized our liberty, but France, whose generosity was paid in blood and debt. He tried desperately to calm the French leadership, meeting with Robespierre's successors and later with the Directory. He reminded them that America sought peace, not betrayal. But trust, once broken, was slow to heal. Amid this political turmoil, Monroe and his wife Elizabeth found brief refuge in Parisian salons, where art and philosophy still flourished. Elizabeth, admired for her grace and tact, softened many doors that might have closed to her husband. The Monroes were seen as symbols of a new world, untainted by monarchy, guided by Republican virtue. It was during this period that Monroe undertook one of his most compassionate acts, the rescue of the Marquis de Lafayette's wife, Adrienne. The Marquis, hero of both the American and French revolutions, languished in an Austrian prison. His wife awaited execution. Monroe intervened, risking diplomatic scandal, and secured her release. She would later write that the Monroes acted not as ambassadors, but as angels. But good deeds could not save him from politics. By 1796, the Washington administration, especially Hamilton's faction, viewed Monroe as dangerously sympathetic to France. They accused him of undermining American neutrality. When his letters of defense arrived too late to sway opinion, Washington dismissed him from his post. The news struck Monroe like a musket ball. He had served faithfully, with honor and idealism, only to be cast aside as naive. Standing once more on the docks of Le Havre, watching the gray Atlantic stretch before him, he realized how cold the world of diplomacy could be. Elizabeth stood beside him, quiet but resolute. She said, "You have spoken truth. History will remember that." And in that moment, Monroe understood something profound, that nations, like people, often betray their ideals in fear of survival. Yet he also knew that ideals, once planted, could not be unrooted so easily. He returned to America disillusioned, but not broken. He wrote a view of the conduct of the executive, a public defense of his actions, and a sharp critique of Washington's policies. It cost him friendships, but gained him followers among Jeffersonian Republicans, who saw him as a man of conviction in an age of compromise. The episode in Paris reshaped Monroe's political philosophy. He began to see the United States not as an isolated republic, but as a symbol with responsibilities, a moral beacon in a world still chained by empires. The seed of what would later become the Monroe Doctrine was sown there, in the fire and betrayal of revolutionary France. As a ship carried him homeward, Monroe gazed at the endless horizon and thought of his country, fragile, young, and already divided by ambition. He vowed that one day he would help guide her, not as an envoy or critic, but as a guardian, one who understood both the cost of freedom and the loneliness of honor. The soldier had become the diplomat. The diplomat was becoming the philosopher. And across the ocean, destiny waited, patient as the tide. When James Monroe returned to Virginia in 1797, he carried with him the invisible scars of diplomacy, wounds not from muskets or sabers, but from betrayal, pride, and the lonely weight of idealism. The voyage home from France had given him months to brood on what he had seen. Revolutions consuming themselves, republics turning into empires, and liberty teetering on the edge of chaos. He disembarked in Norfolk thinner, quieter, and more thoughtful than when he had left. Virginia greeted him as a hero. To ordinary citizens, Monroe was the patriot who had fought in the Revolution, served with Washington, and faced the fury of the French Revolution with integrity. But among the political elite, reactions were mixed. Federalists whispered that he was too French, too sympathetic to the passions that had drowned Paris in blood. To the Jeffersonians, the emerging Republican faction, Monroe was a man vindicated by suffering, a martyr for Republican virtue. The America he returned to was not the same fragile experiment he had helped defend a decade earlier. It was now a battlefield of ideas. Alexander Hamilton's Federalists envisioned a strong central government tied by trade and diplomacy to Great Britain. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison dreamed instead of an agrarian democracy, a nation of independent farmers, each free from the corruption of cities and monarchies. Monroe, after his Paris ordeal, leaned firmly toward Jefferson's vision. He had seen the perils of concentrated power and wanted no king, no court, no aristocracy, not even one draped in Republican robes. In his first speeches after returning home, Monroe's tone had sharpened. If liberty is not watched, he warned, it will be stolen, not by foreign kings, but by men who wear the title of patriot while serving power. That warning resonated deeply in Virginia, where memories of rebellion and independence were still fresh. Monroe spent 2 quiet years rebuilding his estate at Oak Hill, tending to debts and writing essays defending the Republican cause. He often met with Madison at Montpelier, the two of them sitting under the old sycamore trees, debating the soul of the nation. Jefferson would sometimes join, bringing his boundless optimism to balance Madison's logic and Monroe's guarded realism. The three Virginians, the Republican triumvirate, which shaped the next half-century of American politics. By 1799, Virginia's people called Monroe to leadership once again. He was elected governor of Virginia, succeeding James Wood. Though the position then held limited formal power, its symbolic weight was enormous. Virginia was still the nation's largest and most influential state, a crucible of ideas and a beacon for the young republic. As governor, Monroe faced a state teetering between pride and unease. The war debt still lingered. Slavery remained both its economic backbone and its moral cancer, a contradiction that haunted Monroe, though he rarely spoke of it in public. He had freed a few of his own enslaved people, yet he, like Jefferson, could not imagine an immediate end to the institution without tearing apart the fragile fabric of the South. History would never fully forgive him for that silence. More immediate were the dangers of foreign war. Relations with France had soured under President John Adams. The quasi-war, an undeclared naval conflict with France, threatened to spill into open battle. Federalist paranoia spread like wildfire. Newspapers warned of French spies and radical sympathizers in every town. The infamous Alien and Sedition Acts, passed in 1798, gave the federal government power to silence dissent and deport foreigners deemed dangerous. To Republicans like Monroe, this was tyranny in the making. As governor, Monroe refused to let Virginia submit quietly. He worked closely with Madison and Jefferson, who secretly drafted the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, declarations asserting that states had the right to resist unconstitutional federal laws. Though cautious, Monroe sympathized with their intent. He saw in those acts the echo of 1776, the eternal struggle between liberty and authority. During this tense time, Monroe's leadership style stood out. He was not a man of thunderous speeches like Patrick Henry, nor a brilliant theorist like Madison. Instead, he ruled through quiet confidence and empathy. He toured the countryside, visiting farms, meeting local militias, and listening more than he spoke. When fear of French invasion or domestic uprising spread, Monroe urged calm. The surest defense of liberty, he told a gathering in Richmond, is a people too steady to be frightened and too wise to be deceived. Yet the governor's duties were not confined to politics. The turn of the century brought practical challenges: roads, education, trade, and the lingering scars of war. Monroe pressed for better public schools and stronger local defense. He also helped oversee the relocation of Virginia's Capitol buildings, ensuring that Richmond remained the political heart of the state. In every decision, his guiding principle was moderation: progress without disorder, liberty without chaos. In private, however, Monroe wrestled with his future. He was respected but not yet celebrated. Jefferson was preparing for another run at the presidency. Madison was his closest ally, and Monroe, though loyal, often felt overshadowed by their brilliance. But ambition stirred within him. He wanted not power, but purpose, a chance to prove that he could do more than mend fences and write letters. That chance arrived in 1803, when Thomas Jefferson, now president, offered Monroe a special diplomatic appointment to France to help negotiate what would become the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson needed someone who understood both the European courts and the pulse of America, someone trustworthy, steady, and brave enough to face Napoleon's France. There was only one man who fit that description. When Jefferson's letter arrived, Monroe read it in silence. Elizabeth, ever his partner in all things, saw the spark return to his eyes. "It seems," he said softly, "that France and I are not done with each other." He resigned as governor, leaving Virginia once again, not as a wounded exile, but as a statesman reborn. This time, he carried not disappointment, but hope, the belief that his service could secure a future vast enough for all Americans. As his carriage rolled toward the docks, Monroe looked back one last time at the hills of his home. The people of Virginia would remember him as a calm leader in anxious times, the steady hand who had held the line between liberty and fear. But Monroe himself knew that his destiny lay not in guarding borders, but in expanding them. The boy who had crossed the Delaware beside Washington was now ready to cross oceans again, not to fight, but to negotiate for a continent. The next chapter of his life would not be written in Richmond's halls, but in Paris, London, and Madrid, in ink and courage, on parchment and history. By the spring of 1803, James Monroe once again found himself on the deck of a ship bound for France, a voyage he had sworn he would never take again. The Atlantic wind clawed at his coat as he stared into the horizon, thinking not of glory, but of the sheer, impossible weight of his mission. This time, he was not a dismissed envoy seeking redemption. He was the representative of a rising power, sent by President Thomas Jefferson to help reshape the destiny of the United States. His orders were simple in theory, daunting in reality. Assist Robert R. Livingston, the American minister in Paris, in negotiating the purchase of New Orleans and the surrounding territory from France. That single city, a humid, lawless jewel at the mouth of the Mississippi, held the key to the American interior. Whoever controlled New Orleans controlled the commerce of half a continent. When Monroe arrived in Paris in late April, the city had changed. Gone was the feverish chaos of revolution. In its place rose the cold precision of empire. The streets were orderly, the soldiers immaculate, the fear quieter but deeper. And at the heart of it all sat Napoleon Bonaparte, the small man with the grandest ambitions Europe had ever known. Livingston greeted Monroe with visible relief. "Thank God you're here," he said, grasping his old friend's hand. "They'll not listen to reason, only to fortune and power. And fortune, my friend, we do not have." France at that moment controlled not only Louisiana, but also the hopes of an entire continent. The Mississippi Valley, stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Rockies, was theoretically French territory, a vast wilderness larger than all of Western Europe. Jefferson had instructed Monroe and Livingston to purchase New Orleans and perhaps a small portion of land along the Mississippi, but Napoleon, for once, was thinking larger. France's empire in the New World was unraveling. The slave revolt in Haiti, led by Toussaint Louverture, had shattered French ambitions in the Caribbean. Napoleon needed money, not colonies. He was preparing for a new war with Britain, and Louisiana Territory, a distant wilderness crawling with mosquitoes and dreams, seemed less valuable than the gold it could bring. When Monroe and Livingston were summoned to the Tuileries Palace, the air was thick with perfume and tension. Napoleon's foreign minister, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, greeted them with his usual sly charm. "Messieurs," he began, "France has little interest in maintaining lands it cannot defend. Perhaps it is time," he paused, "for America to grow." Monroe and Livingston exchanged a glance, the kind of wordless look shared only by men standing on the edge of history. Within days, negotiations began in earnest. The French proposal stunned the Americans. For $15 million, the United States could purchase the entire Louisiana Territory, more than 800,000 square miles of land stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. It was, quite literally, an empire's ransom. Monroe's first reaction was disbelief. It is not only New Orleans, it is half a continent, more land than any of us can imagine owning or governing. The map itself bends under its weight. The deal raised serious questions. Jefferson, a strict constitutionalist, had always argued that the federal government could only exercise powers explicitly granted by the Constitution. Now, he was preparing to buy territory from a foreign empire, something the Constitution said nothing about. Monroe, pragmatic as ever, urged action. "Let us secure the land first," he advised, "and justify it later." It was a rare moment where idealism and practicality met halfway. Jefferson trusted Monroe's judgment. The Louisiana Purchase Treaty was signed on April 30th, 1803. With a single stroke of a quill, the United States doubled its size. When the news reached America, celebrations erupted, bells rang, newspapers proclaimed a new dawn, and citizens dreamed of endless lands where freedom could take root. The Mississippi, once a western border, became the nation's spine. Yet, not everyone rejoiced. Federalists denounced the purchase as reckless, unconstitutional, even dangerous. They sneered that the United States had bought a desert and that Jefferson had overstepped his authority. Some in New England even whispered of secession. But Monroe ignored the noise. He had walked the marble halls of Europe and seen the hunger of empires. He knew what the purchase truly meant. "France has sold us her shadow," he told Madison in a private letter. "But in that shadow lies the future of our republic." Monroe's triumph in Paris earned him international respect. He was later dispatched to London, where he worked to ease growing tensions with Britain over maritime rights, a mission far less glorious and far more frustrating. The British viewed American diplomacy as amateurish, and Monroe's patience was tested daily by the arrogance of the empire he once fought against. Still, the success of the Louisiana Purchase had changed him. For the first time, Monroe understood America as something more than a fragile republic. It was a continental idea, destined to stretch from ocean to ocean. The Revolution gave the nation life. The Louisiana Purchase gave it space to grow. When returning to America in 1807, Monroe was greeted as a national hero. Crowds gathered to see him ride through the streets of Richmond. Jefferson, ever the philosopher, embraced his old friend with quiet pride. "You have done more for our republic than any man since Washington drew his sword." But glory, as Monroe knew too well, is never permanent. The seeds of future conflict already lay buried in that vast new land. The question of slavery, the fate of native nations, the balance between free and slave states. The Louisiana Territory was a canvas, yes, but also a powder keg. As he stood beneath the twilight sky at Monticello, looking westward, Monroe confessed to Jefferson, We have bought a future that we do not understand. Jefferson smiled, his eyes distant. No one ever does, James. That is the burden of vision. For Monroe, the Louisiana Purchase was both triumph and prophecy. It secured his place among the nation's great builders, but it also marked the beginning of the long shadow that would one day divide the Republic. But still, in that moment, as he watched the sun set over the Virginia hills, he allowed himself one quiet satisfaction. He had helped turn the dream of a republic into the reality of a nation. And the world, vast, uncertain, magnificent, now belonged to America's future. By the year 1808, James Monroe was a man both celebrated and restless. He had helped secure the Louisiana Purchase, the greatest territorial expansion in American history. Yet his political fortunes were curiously uncertain. The Republic, swollen in size and ambition, was also swelling with division, and Monroe, once Jefferson's trusted envoy, now found himself drifting between admiration and resentment, torn by loyalty and pride. The seat of power in Washington had grown colder. The Revolution's brotherhood was giving way to rivalries cloaked in civility. Thomas Jefferson was nearing the end of his presidency, his hair graying, his patience waning. The nation he had envisioned as a peaceful agrarian haven was now entangled in the machinery of European wars. Across the Atlantic, Napoleon's empire devoured the continent, while Britain's navy ruled the seas. Both nations, locked in a struggle for dominance, began seizing American ships, forcing sailors into their service, and trampling the young nation's sovereignty. American merchants cried for protection. The people demanded dignity. To Jefferson, the answer was peace through economic resistance. The Embargo Act of 1807, halting all trade with foreign powers. To Monroe, it was a strangling mistake. The embargo crippled American commerce, punished farmers and shipbuilders, and starved the very citizens it aims to protect. We are punishing ourselves, Monroe lamented in a letter, to prove that we will not be bullied. Still, Monroe remained loyal. He had seen Europe's madness firsthand. He knew how small nations were swallowed whole by empires. And so, while Jefferson's popularity waned under the weight of economic despair, Monroe stayed largely silent, patient, calculating, watching the winds shift. When James Madison, his old friend and intellectual rival, succeeded Jefferson in 1809, Monroe hoped for reconciliation and a return to purpose. Madison, however, was wary. The two men had grown distant, one a theorist, the other a man of action. Monroe expected a prominent role in the new administration, perhaps Secretary of State. But Madison, cautious and surrounded by his own circle of allies, hesitated. Monroe returned once again to private life in Virginia, his pride wounded. At Oak Hill, he tried to content himself with family, books, and long rides through the rolling hills. But history had marked him for restlessness. He could not sit idle while the Republic trembled between peace and war. By 1810, the nation's patience with Britain was wearing thin. American ships were seized, sailors impressed, and frontier conflicts with native tribes, many armed by the British, flared into bloodshed. The call for war grew louder, and Monroe's name once again surfaced in the political arena. That same year, Madison, recognizing both Monroe's influence and experience, offered him the post of Secretary of State. Monroe hesitated, his pride still smarting from past slights, but Elizabeth urged him to accept. "You have always served your country. Do not stop now when it needs you most." When Monroe entered Madison's cabinet in 1811, he found a government divided and uncertain. The war hawks, young and fiery congressmen like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, demanded immediate conflict with Britain. They saw war not as folly, but as renewal, a second revolution to defend America's honor. Others urged caution, fearing the ruin of a fledgling nation. Monroe walked the line between them. He despised British arrogance, but feared the cost of open war. In cabinet meetings, his voice was calm but firm. "If we fight," he said, "let it be not for vengeance, but for the independence of our conduct among nations." By 1812, diplomacy had failed. The United States declared war on Great Britain. The nation, barely 36 years old, was again facing the empire it had defied. Monroe knew what that meant. He had seen the fires of Trenton and the blood at Monmouth. He knew that patriotism was a fine banner, but a poor shield. The War of 1812 began badly. American forces were ill-prepared, poorly led, and divided by regional interests. The invasion of Canada failed. Detroit fell. In the Atlantic, British ships blockaded ports and terrorized the coast. Jefferson's dream of a peaceful republic was gone, replaced by cannon fire and fear. As Secretary of State, Monroe's task was to hold the government together while war threatened to tear it apart. He worked tirelessly, often by candlelight, drafting letters to generals, negotiating with Congress, coordinating supplies, and managing diplomacy in Europe. When Secretary of War John Armstrong faltered under pressure, Monroe quietly stepped in, performing both roles. His greatest test came in 1814, when British troops landed in Maryland and marched on Washington. The capital panicked. Madison fled the city. The British set fire to the Capitol, the Treasury, and finally the White House itself. The night sky turned crimson, the heat so fierce that windows shattered miles away. While chaos reigned, Monroe rode through the burning streets on horseback, rallying what remained of the defense. Witnesses later recalled his calm, almost ghostly composure amid the flames. He was no longer the young soldier crossing the Delaware. He was the guardian of a nation fighting for its soul. Dolly Monroe, the First Lady, famously saved the portrait of George Washington from the burning White House that night. It was Monroe who helped coordinate the evacuation, ensuring vital state papers and symbols of government survived. In the aftermath of the burning of Washington, Monroe became Madison's indispensable man. Armstrong resigned in disgrace, and Monroe officially took on the duties of both Secretary of State and Secretary of War. It was an impossible task, yet Monroe managed it with relentless energy and quiet authority. Under his guidance, the shattered army began to rebuild. New generals rose, men like Andrew Jackson, whose ferocity at the Battle of New Orleans would later make him a legend. Monroe oversaw troop deployments, arranged finances, and kept the government's heart beating when it seemed the republic itself might collapse. When news of Jackson's victory reached Washington in early 1815, the capital erupted in jubilation. The war, though inconclusive on paper, ended as a moral triumph. America had survived, not as a colony, not as a pawn, but as a nation that could stand against the world's greatest empire and remain unbroken. As peace settled over the land, Monroe stood on the steps of the rebuilt Capitol beside Madison, his uniform dusty, his hair streaked with gray. The people cheered the president, but they also looked to Monroe, the man who had stayed when others fled, who had worked without sleep to hold the republic together. In that applause, he heard not the sound of glory, but of duty fulfilled. He had been a soldier, envoy, governor, and statesman. Now, at last, the nation was whole again, and Monroe's path was clear. The next test would not come from war abroad, but from unity at home. The soldier of the Revolution was about to become the president of peace. The war was over, but the scars of fire and fear lingered like ghosts in the marble streets of Washington. James Monroe, now 57, walked through the half-rebuilt Capitol with a quiet pride. The war that had nearly broken the young republic had, paradoxically, forged its soul. Out of chaos, something solid had been born, a national spirit, raw but real. President Madison, worn thin by years of conflict, had no illusions about the future. "The nation needs healing," he told Monroe one evening as they sat by the fire in the modest, new executive mansion. "And it needs a man who can carry peace like a banner." Monroe said nothing, but in his silence was understanding. When Madison stepped down in 1817, Monroe stood as the natural heir, the last of the revolutionary generation still active in politics, a man of proven loyalty and calm resolve. His name carried the echo of the war's endurance, and that was enough. His inauguration day dawned under clear skies. Crowds lined the avenues, waving flags stitched by hand, many still smelling faintly of gunpowder from the war years. Monroe took the oath beneath a canopy of blue, his voice steady, his hand firm on the Bible. Nearby, old veterans saluted with trembling hands. It was as if the revolution itself were blessing its final son. What followed was unlike any presidency before it. Newspapers began calling it the era of good feelings, a phrase that captured both hope and illusion. Partisan politics seemed to fade. The Federalist Party, once fierce in opposition, was dying. For the first time, Americans from north to south, east to west, seemed to agree on something. The nation's survival meant its destiny was now its own. Monroe, however, was too seasoned to trust the calm. Beneath the harmony, he sensed quiet fault lines, economic rifts, regional jealousy, and the ever-shadowing question of slavery. Still, he believed in the possibility of unity, and he set about governing not as a partisan leader, but as a national father figure. He traveled across the country, visiting towns that no president had ever seen. His journey through New England, once the stronghold of Federalist resentment, was met with cheers and church bells. Farmers left their plows. Shipbuilders halted their work to shake his hand. In Boston, a newspaper wrote, "It seems the whole nation loves him." Monroe's calm, almost stoic demeanor had a peculiar magic. He did not charm with words, but with presence. He listened more than he spoke. He smiled little, but when he did, it felt earned. The people saw in him not glamour, but steadiness, a man who would not falter. His cabinet, too, reflected this ideal of competence over ideology. He appointed John Quincy Adams as Secretary of State, a man brilliant, cold, and fiercely independent. Adams would later craft some of the most significant doctrines of Monroe's presidency. For the Treasury, he chose William H. Crawford, a Southerner with ambition as sharp as his temper. For war, he relied on John C. Calhoun, young, intelligent, and already showing the fire that would one day threaten to tear the Union apart. The peace that followed the War of 1812 brought prosperity, but also temptation. Industry grew, trade expanded, and cities began to hum with new life. Yet prosperity, Monroe knew, was as fragile as any treaty. In 1819, his fears proved right. The Panic of 1819, the nation's first great financial crisis, struck like a sudden storm. Banks failed, farms were seized, and men who had cheered Monroe's name now cursed it in the streets. The boom of wartime trade had collapsed into a pit of debt and despair. Monroe was no economist, but he understood human nature. He refused to scapegoat or panic. "The Republic is not a house of cards," he told his cabinet. "It bends, but it does not fall." He worked quietly to stabilize credit, support state relief efforts, and calm the nation's nerves. Slowly, confidence returned. His even hand and refusal to dramatize won back the public's faith. But even as the economy healed, another wound opened, one that would not close so easily. In 1820, the Missouri crisis erupted. Missouri's application for statehood came with a demand to allow slavery, threatening to upset the delicate balance between free and slave states. The debate ignited fierce passions. In Congress, men shouted until their throats bled. The question was no longer about Missouri. It was about the soul of America. Could a nation founded on liberty continue to tolerate bondage? Monroe, personally uneasy with slavery but politically cautious, walked a perilous line. The Missouri Compromise, engineered by Henry Clay, became the uneasy solution. Missouri would enter as a slave state, Maine as a free one, and slavery would be banned north of latitude 36 degrees 30. Monroe signed it reluctantly, knowing it was not a cure, but a truce. "We have silenced the quarrel," he said quietly, "not ended it." Yet even amidst this tension, Monroe achieved something extraordinary: the Monroe Doctrine. Conceived in 1823 with heavy input from Adams, it declared that the Americas were closed to European colonization and interference. The New World, Monroe proclaimed, is henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. It was bold, defiant, and profoundly modern. A declaration that America had grown from a trembling experiment into a force with its own sphere of destiny. The world took notice. In London, diplomats grumbled. In Madrid, old men shook their heads. But in the Americas, young nations newly freed from colonial rule looked to the United States with new respect. That night, when the doctrine was sent to Congress, Monroe sat alone in his study. The candles had burned low, and the ink on his hand smudged slightly. As he wrote, Elizabeth entered quietly, placing her hand on his shoulder. "You've drawn a line across the world," she said softly. "Not across the world," he replied, "across time." By the end of his second term, Monroe had become something rare, a president almost universally loved. There were no scandals, no great betrayals, no dramatic speeches. His was a reign of quiet strength, the calm between two storms. When he left office in 1825, the nation was larger, prouder, and more united than when he had found it. Yet beneath the surface, he knew what others did not. Unity, built on compromise, cannot last forever. As he rolled back to Virginia, the crowd still cheered, but the sound already felt distant. Monroe, ever the soldier, ever the servant, understood that peace, true peace, is never permanent. History, like war, always returns. By the time James Monroe left Washington in 1825, his hair had turned the color of the parchment on which the Declaration of Independence was written. The cheers of farewell still echoed behind him, yet he felt a strange quiet settle over his heart. For 40 years, he had served the Republic, in war and in peace, in poverty and power. Now, for the first time, he was simply a citizen again. He and Elizabeth returned to their estate at Oak Hill, a serene expanse of Virginia countryside. The house, white-pillared and calm, sat amid rolling hills dotted with oak and hickory. There was peace there, the kind of peace that only those who have survived storms can truly feel. Monroe would wake early, as he had done during the war, and walk the fields alone. Sometimes he paused, watching the mist lift from the grass, the world returning to light. He often thought of Washington, Jefferson, and Madison, his comrades in the grand experiment. All but one were gone now, their memories carried in the whispers of history and the marble echoes of the Capitol. Yet retirement did not bring wealth. Public service had been his life, but it had never made him rich. His years as president had drained his fortune. He had paid for official functions out of his own pocket, believing it unworthy to build the nation he loved. Now, those debts weighed on him like old wounds that refused to heal. The Monroes lived modestly, Elizabeth managing the household with grace and quiet pride. Still, the creditors came, polite but persistent, and Monroe's dignity suffered each time he had to defer payment. He wrote letters to Congress, humbly requesting reimbursement for his personal expenses during his diplomatic missions and presidency. "I have devoted my life to the service of my country," he wrote, "and find myself at its close without resources." The requests were often delayed, debated, or forgotten. The new generation of politicians, men born after the Revolution, saw him as a relic of another age. Still, Monroe's spirit did not sour. Visitors to Oak Hill found him gentle, reflective, and surprisingly optimistic. He spoke not of loss, but of endurance. The republic, he would say, is stronger than any one man. It will stumble, but it will stand. He followed politics with interest, but little envy. The country was changing, faster than he could have imagined. Steam engines roared, factories sprouted, and newspapers now reached towns he had once visited by horseback. America was no longer a fragile dream. It was a restless giant learning its stride. Elizabeth's health, however, began to fail. The years of travel, worry, and constant public life had worn her down. Monroe, ever the soldier, became her nurse and companion. Those who visited Oak Hill in the late 1820s recalled seeing the aging statesman reading aloud by the window, Elizabeth resting in a chair beside him, her hand in his. Their love, tested by distance, politics, and time, remained unbroken. When she died in 1830, Monroe was inconsolable. "Half of me," he wrote to a friend, "is gone." After her passing, the house grew too quiet. His daughters, concerned for his health, persuaded him to move to New York City to live with his youngest daughter, Maria, and her husband, Samuel Governor. It was a city unlike any Monroe had known, loud, growing, filled with strangers. The cobbled streets rang with the clatter of carts and the shouts of merchants. Ships crowded the harbor, their sails gleaming in the morning light. America's future, Monroe realized, was no longer found in the old Virginia plantations, but in the bustling energy of these northern ports. Though his body weakened, his mind remained sharp. He welcomed visitors, students, journalists, and young politicians who came to seek the counsel of the last founding father. They expected grand speeches, but Monroe offered quiet wisdom instead. "Do not seek to govern for glory," he told one young ambitious man. "Seek to govern for peace. Glory fades, but peace endures." In 1831, his health began to fail rapidly. The years of hardship, the loss of Elizabeth, and the weight of history all pressed upon him. Yet he faced death with the same calm he had carried into every battle. On July 4th, 1831, as fireworks lit the skies over New York and the nation celebrated its independence, Monroe lay quietly in his bed, his breathing shallow. A friend later wrote that as the sounds of celebration reached his window, a faint smile touched his lips. "It is fitting," he whispered, "to go on this day." At 73, James Monroe, soldier, diplomat, governor, president, and patriot, joined Jefferson and Adams, both of whom had also died on the 4th of July. 3 men, bound by friendship and fate, had left this world on the same sacred day. To many Americans, it seemed a divine sign, as if Providence itself were drawing a line under the first great chapter of the Republic's story. Monroe's funeral was solemn but dignified. In New York, crowds lined the streets to honor the last revolutionary president. Soldiers marched, drums beat softly, and flags dipped in respect. His coffin was draped in the Stars and Stripes, a banner that had been new when he was young and now waved proudly over a continent he had helped to shape.
For more than 2 decades, his remains rested in New York's Marble Cemetery. But in 1858, long after the Civil War had begun to darken the land he loved, Virginia called him home. His body was reinterred in Richmond beneath an ornate Gothic monument now known as the Governor's Circle. The inscription was simple: James Monroe, author of the Monroe Doctrine, patriot, statesman, friend of liberty. Even now, his legacy endures not in statues or speeches, but in the principles he lived by: quiet strength, steady duty, and faith in the Republic's promise. He had never sought to be the loudest voice, nor the most celebrated, but rather the most steadfast. The era of good feelings faded, replaced by the turbulence of sectional conflict. Yet, in every American ideal of peace, unity, and independence, there remains a whisper of Monroe, the last revolutionary standing watch over the dawn of a new age. In his twilight, he had said to a visitor, "The work of liberty is never finished. It only passes to new hands."
The years after Monroe's passing were filled with thunder, the thunder of division, ambition, and machines. The America he had nurtured into unity began to fracture under the weight of its contradictions. Railroads tore through forests, cotton boomed in the South, factories choked the air of northern cities, and the uneasy balance between freedom and bondage began to tremble. Yet, even as new generations quarreled over what the Republic should be, they still invoked the name of James Monroe, the man who had once made peace sound like power. His presidency, which historians later called the calm between tempests, seemed almost mythic in retrospect. To school children, he became the symbol of a simpler America, a nation unspoiled by the greed and turmoil that followed. But to scholars and statesmen, Monroe's true genius lay in his restraint. He was not a man of flamboyant ideas or radical reforms. His greatness came from steadiness, a rare virtue in a young country addicted to passion. Monroe's era of good feelings had not been an accident. It was the deliberate work of a man who believed that national unity was not born of uniformity, but of empathy. He governed as if he were stitching the torn flag of the Revolution back together, thread by thread, state by state. While Jefferson dreamed and Hamilton schemed, Monroe balanced, bridged, and bound. His Monroe Doctrine, at the time little more than a bold paragraph in a State of the Union address, became the cornerstone of American foreign policy for centuries. When European powers sought to reclaim territories in the Western Hemisphere, Monroe's words stood as an invisible wall. The American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. That single sentence changed the world. It declared, without bluster, that America had grown up, no longer a colony, but a guardian. It was a diplomatic revolution cloaked in calm language, a quiet defiance that carried the gravity of a cannon. In time, presidents from Polk to Kennedy, from Roosevelt to Reagan would echo it. Yet, none spoke it with Monroe's humility, for to him, it was not about dominance, but about destiny, the right of every nation to stand unchained. In Virginia, where his body lay beneath a canopy of oak trees, Monroe's memory lingered, not as marble grandeur, but as a whisper on the wind. Farmers spoke of him with the warmth reserved for neighbors. He was one of us, they said, a man who had walked their roads, fought in their wars, and returned home to share their burdens. Unlike Jefferson, who dazzled with philosophy, or Madison, who crafted constitutions, Monroe's genius was practical, grounded, and deeply human. He had known hunger, debt, loss, and defeat, And from each, he drew patience. When Washington's icy river crossings froze his boots, he kept marching. When political allies betrayed him, he refused to slander. When poverty followed him even after the presidency, he bore it with dignity. Fortune, he once told his daughter, is a weather vane. It turns, but honor stands still. Generations later, Monroe's name faded from the lips of orators, but his influence remained in the fabric of the Republic itself. Every time America faced a crisis, whether from without or within, echoes of his philosophy resurfaced: calm over chaos, compromise over conflict, principle over pride. He had governed without spectacle, believing that virtue should be quiet and leadership should serve, not shine. That modesty made him less celebrated than Washington or Jefferson, but perhaps more essential. He had not built monuments. He had kept the nation whole long enough for others to dream again. When the Civil War finally erupted decades after his death, both North and South invoked Monroe's vision of America, each side claiming to defend the legacy of unity he had worked so patiently to build. It was a tragic irony, but also a testament to the power of his ideal. Even as the country tore itself apart, the idea of the Union, that invisible thread of belonging, remained the echo of his voice. Monroe's personal papers, discovered years later, revealed little bitterness. In his letters, he rarely complained of betrayal or neglect. Instead, they were filled with gratitude to his friends, his family, and to Providence for the chance to serve. In one unfinished note, likely written near the end of his life, he wrote, "I have seen the Republic through its infancy. May it walk with wisdom through its youth." And it did, though not without stumbles. Every generation of Americans would wrestle with the same questions Monroe had faced. How do you hold liberty together? How do you build unity out of difference? His example offered no easy answers, but a method: patience, humility, courage without vanity. When visitors now walk past his tomb in Richmond, they see a structure of iron and stone, sharp with Gothic spires and soft with age. Few realize that beneath those arches lies not just a man, but a message. That greatness need not shout. That peace, when built with integrity, can outlast the noise of war and ambition. In the nation's capital, a portrait of Monroe still hangs in the White House, his expression calm, his eyes neither proud nor weary, but watchful. It is the gaze of a man who believed that leadership was not about command, but about care. In every president who chose diplomacy over bluster, every soldier who fought not for conquest, but for principle, and every citizen who held faith in the Republic's promise despite its flaws, there lived a small reflection of Monroe. As one historian wrote many years later, Washington founded the nation, Jefferson defined its ideals, Madison gave it laws, but Monroe gave it peace. That peace, however fragile, is his true monument, not carved in stone, but carried in the long, unfinished heartbeat of America.
The summer air of 1831 was heavy with celebration. Bells rang from steeples, cannons thundered from harbors, and fireworks burst above a young nation that had survived its first half-century. America was 55 years old, still brash, still growing, still unsure of its future. On that 4th of July, as citizens toasted the Stars and Stripes, one man lay quietly in a small room on Prince Street in New York City, the last living thread to the revolution that had birthed it. James Monroe, frail but dignified, rested near a window where the faint scent of salt from the harbor drifted in. Outside, he could hear laughter, music, and the rhythmic beat of marching drums. It was a fitting farewell. For Monroe, the last revolutionary president, would not live to see another dawn. His breathing slowed, his thoughts drifted between memory and eternity, and when the final fireworks faded, he was gone. He died on the same day that had claimed Jefferson and Adams before him, July 4th, as if the nation itself had chosen to escort its founders gently into myth. News of his death spread quickly through the city. The newspapers called him the last of the founders.
In the South, farmers paused their work. In Washington, officials lowered the flag to half-mast. Across the Atlantic, in Europe, diplomats remembered the man whose calm words had once redrawn the world's balance of power. The tributes were respectful but restrained. Monroe had never been a man of spectacle, and even in death, his humility persisted. Yet history, with its strange sense of irony, took time to recognize his magnitude. For decades, Monroe was overshadowed by his more flamboyant peers. Washington's grandeur, Jefferson's intellect, Jackson's ferocity. But with time, as scholars peeled back the layers of early American politics, Monroe emerged as something rarer, the glue that had held the Republic together when it might easily have split apart. He was a bridge between generations, the soldier who fought under Washington, the student of Jefferson, the colleague of Madison, and the mentor to John Quincy Adams. In his calm, he carried the wisdom of the old world. In his policies, the promise of the new. He had seen America in its infancy, fragile, fractious, uncertain, and left it a confident, growing nation stretching from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. His presidency, once dismissed as uneventful, came to be seen as the pivot of American identity. The Monroe Doctrine became the declaration of hemispheric independence, the invisible line that told Europe, "You had your turn, now let us have ours." It was not a boast, but a principle, that nations, like men, must stand on their own.
Historians would later call his administration the calm between storms, that brief golden interlude before the tempests of slavery, industrialization, and civil war. But perhaps it was more than that. Perhaps it was the breath between the Republic's battles, the space in which its people learned to live, not just to fight. In private letters, Monroe often reflected on the fleeting nature of power. "The office passes," he wrote, "but the duty remains." He believed that presidents were not kings, but custodians, guardians of an idea larger than themselves. To him, liberty was not a shout from a battlefield. It was the daily discipline of decency, law, and patience. When his body was returned to Virginia in 1858, the country he had left behind was on the edge of civil war. His coffin traveled by steamboat and rail through towns that bore both his name and his legacy. Monroe County, Monroe City, Fort Monroe, quiet memorials scattered like echoes of gratitude. In Richmond, thousands gathered to watch his reburial beneath the towering Gothic canopy, now known as the Governor's Circle. The rain fell lightly that day, as if the heavens themselves were offering a benediction. The inscription on his tomb reads simply, "James Monroe, author of the Monroe Doctrine, patriot, statesman, friend of liberty." It is a modest epitaph, but fitting. Monroe never sought fame, only service. He had stood beside Washington at Trenton, stared down European empires, soothed a divided nation, and died believing the Republic would endure. His name became synonymous not with conquest or charisma, but with continuity, the steady hand on the tiller of a young and unsteady ship. In the generations that followed, presidents invoked his example whenever unity seemed impossible. Lincoln admired his calm in crisis. Theodore Roosevelt drew upon his doctrine to shape America's global stance. Even in modern times, his words echo through every act of American diplomacy that asserts independence without arrogance. What Monroe left behind was not a monument, but a moral compass, a sense that strength and humility need not be opposites, that a nation's greatness is measured not by how loudly it speaks, but by how faithfully it keeps its promises. Today, As America continues to wrestle with its ideals, Monroe's life remains a quiet guide. He reminds us that revolutions are not finished when the cannons fall silent. They must be tended, renewed, and refined through generations. He was the last revolutionary not because of his age, but because of his faith. Faith that liberty could survive human imperfection. Faith that America, for all its contradictions, was still worth the long struggle of hope. If Washington gave the Republic its sword, Jefferson its voice, and Madison its mind, then Monroe gave it its heart, steady, loyal, and kind. And perhaps that is why, as fireworks still blaze across American skies every 4th of July, one can imagine a faint echo of that same quiet voice, the voice of a soldier turned statesman who believed that the truest victory of a nation was not in war, but in the endurance of its peace.
If you liked this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so we can keep bringing you more great stories.